Hello and welcome back. In this video, we are moving on to looking at different cyber attacks. But first, we're going to go over about history of those attacks, right? So how did it all start? Well, before the internet, the only way to conduct a cyber attack is actually via physical access because you had no means to communicate to other devices, which means you have to actually be there. You have to actually be there, right? But the computational power at the time was very low. You can think about they were advertising like RAMs in kilobytes and computation powers in hundreds, maybe even thousands processes per second. You know, those are really those are actually quite slow compared to modern times. So they did not store much things to steal anyway. Okay, and then in the 80s, we had the TCP/IP that was designed. IPv4. And unfortunately, IPv4 was not really taking into account how people may exploit different networking components. And hence, we still face many of the security issues that comes from IPv4, and we do still use it because not all devices have phased out of it. So, however, we do have IPv6 that has been rolling out, and some devices are operating under that. But more often than not, you will find your computer capable of both IPv4 and IPv6 at this time. Okay. As a consequence, although there have been other communication protocols and procedures, whatnot, but TCP/IP became the mainstream, and therefore it became to be used everywhere. So this includes your local area network, metropolitan area network, wide area network. Anywhere you use it, it's based on TCP/IP. So you can think about how you browse the web. At application layer, everything is quite dictated to HTTPS at port 443. You go down to the networking layer, pretty much everything is embedded into the TCP/IP layer. It's there. Okay. So now we know some connectivities between computers, and because of that, attackers don't necessarily have to physically be there to steal stuff now. They can just remotely connect, do stuff, and take away things they need. And that's where stuff starts to really get intense. There are many events that contribute towards attack trends. For example, there are more people using the internet. So the number of people that are connected to the internet is increasing very quickly. Moreover, there are more devices because of introduction to things like IoT, where multitudes of devices are being connected through the internet and providing data, like sensor measurements. It could be as simple as temperatures, or humidities, but it can be as fatal as somebody's health monitoring systems and so forth. So, and those are all traveling around in the internet. Okay, so that makes it very easy for attackers to start getting into it and target people. Okay, and now we have more complexity in softwares that we develop. We have a lot of different approaches to build them. Long time ago, we started with the waterfall design, but that's no longer the case anymore. You probably heard about Agile, DevOps, things like this. And the way we develop things became more complex, and as a result, software itself becomes quite complex, depending on the scale. So when somebody asks you to develop, say, a specific scientific calculator for this particular purpose, you're not going to build it from the scratch. There's going to be tons of libraries that you can use and things like that. So there is this shared resources, but at the same time, those dependencies could be a vulnerable point where attackers can exploit, right? Because if you use a library that happens to have some vulnerability that can be exploited, then your software will also be able to be exploited through that way. Okay. And now we also have a lot of availability of now we also have a lot of tools that allow people to conduct attacks without having to understand the underlying details, the technical details. So things like using offensive security tools. So if you heard about Kali Linux, it comes with a lot of tools already installed for you to use. Things like that. That makes it really easy for people to just quickly learn how to use tools and launch attacks. In the labs, you will do some simple ones, but as mentioned in many of the lab instructions and in lectures, you are not supposed to use those in outside of your lab environment, okay? Because it is illegal in Australia and pretty much everywhere else. And the attacks that we test during the labs are very easy to detect. Okay, so I don't want any of my students, get involved in those criminal activities and so forth. All right, and we have more dependencies in the cyberspace that makes it easy for people to target us. So, for example, even just 20 years ago, we didn't use mobile for anything but just calling and texting. But nowadays, you have a lot of apps installed, even your health apps that monitors your habits and whatnot. And all of those information, personal information, are very, very much targeted by attackers because they provide some values to them. Okay, and this can be quite subjective, but in one way or the other, there are some lack of security implementation, deployment, and adoption. For example, you probably made some apps, softwares in the past, say a couple of years in your degree or whatnot, or out of your hobby, but how often have you thought about how secure your product is? Okay, and although we try to teach as much as possible about good practice of how to securely create your applications and softwares. Now, often because of the time constraints or resource constraints, security is seen as something that could be fixed later on. But later we will cover about software development that is not always the case. So what are we looking at? Well, this data is just a couple of years old, so still quite relevant. And as you can see, when it first introduced around 90s, not many people know about network connectiveness, but really it picked up in the 2000s. From 2000s that people started to buy computers and connect to the internet and start doing stuff, right? And as it became more popular among people, that more people are using it, the number of attacks actually going up because people are sharing informations there, easy to contact them, it's just flick an email, like a spam mail, and so forth. So the trend in the past years have been increasing, and we suspect as more people and more devices get connected through the internet, there will be more criminal activities that we'll observe in the future as well. Okay, and conducting attacks has been becoming easier. So this graph shows you it's nearly 20-year-old graph, but even then it shows you how simple it is becoming to launch an attack. So here the green bar shows you the intruder knowledge. So over the years, to actually launch an attack, you have to be highly knowledgeable in what you're trying to achieve. You need to implement step by step everything. But through that time, people, don't really want to rewrite every single attack script, right? So they make it into a tool, and those tools get shared. And as more tools get developed like this, if you look up some of the attack tools now, you don't really have to understand how it works underneath, but all you need to know is how to utilize this tool to achieve what you want to do. And unfortunately, that's where a lot of people kind of sit at. And it makes sense because there's a lot of attacks that you can do nowadays, and unless you're really enthusiastic about those, it is very time consuming to learn all the technical aspects of all these attacks. Okay, but anyway, as a consequence, attackers don't have to be knowledgeable. You just run a bunch of scripts you can find online, and believe it or not, it's quite easy to find them. And that reflected by the attack sophistication. So you're building tools to attack some basic aspects, so like password cracking or disabling audits or installing backdoors. But as attack gets more complicated, we have more sophistication in what the tool allows us to do now. Okay, so here's a report just last year from Symantec Internet Security Group. It shows you different trends. So for instance, the phishing rate, although our phishing detection is becoming more advanced, it's not necessarily deterring attackers to send less. Why? Because there is a lot more story behind, like the way that spam mails are generated is not really generated such that you can pinpoint to who started generating this because of its distributed nature. Okay, malicious email rates kind of looks like it's increasing, but it can also be quite seasonal. Spam rate is also hovering over 54%. So this tells us that some of the attacks like these tends to stay around and linger us for a long period of time. Okay, so attacks evolve with time, and that's pretty much the key challenges in cybersecurity today. What we want to do is be a step ahead of attackers. Before they find out a new ways to exploit things, we want to be there, discover that first, and then provide protection mechanism against it. That's the most ideal case, but that's not always the case, right? So also another aspect we are concerned is if they do find some attacks, how can we respond as fast as possible to minimize the damage and impact? Okay, so you may have heard of some of those recent attacks like deepfakes. Deepfakes has been used intensely in video imaging, like this. Okay, see here on one side you see person A, and on the other side you see person B. And what deepfakes allows you to do is morph them together to create another face. For instance, this is one of the most widely used application of deepfakes. So you can see the middle picture kind of looks like an actual person, but this person actually doesn't exist, right? And deepfakes are not just the images, but it can be applied in videos, voices, and any other context where you can morph multiple objects to create something that hasn't been there before but looks realistic. Okay, so the deepfakes is all about creating something that is not true but looks realistic, that it can fool people. So the attacks moving from there are still a lot of technical attacks, but also trying to exploit how people perceive information and data nowadays. So that's another aspect. AI-powered cyber attacks. There's a lot of AI modules that can be utilized. Disinformation in social media. You probably heard a lot about information about COVID-19 on social medias and through news, but can you be sure that the information that you read or see is actually true, right? And there has been a study where a lot of information on social media is actually not quite true, and therefore it is quite important for us to provide some sort of mechanism to make it easier for people to determine whether the information provided to you is actually true or not. And not just that, vehicle cyber attacks, for instance, attacks are now affecting our physical domain as well, because those physical devices are now linked with cyber domain. So like the newer cars you see nowadays, they can be connected to the internet. You can control it from your mobile phones. But that means attacker can also do the same by exploiting some loopholes or vulnerabilities. Okay, cloudjacking. Essentially, cloudjacking is an attack where the attacker hijacks your cloud resources and starts doing some mining for cryptocurrency. Okay, but eventually this might fade away as the cryptocurrency matures and mining no longer provides you as much incentives as the efforts. Okay, but nevertheless, this is still something that people do, and essentially, if they do it large scale quite easily, then obviously this is going to be quite profitable for them to continue to do so. Okay. So here's a question to ask you before we move on. What issues do cyber attacks bring? And you can pause the video here and have a think about its impact in our society today. Okay, so the very first thing you probably came up with, technological impact, right? Because it is exploiting directly on our current technologies. So we need to make sure that there are no loopholes or vulnerabilities that attackers can exploit any further. So there has been a lot of development in secure software engineering, creating different solutions, mitigation techniques. We will cover these in later on. But it also brings economic issues, right? Because not cyber attacks aren't really just people looking for fun, but often they have some motives. For instance, people want to steal credit card information. They want to do cloud jacking to do some mining, crypto, and all those are economically linked to cyber attacks. But also it can be sociological impact as well as psychological. Okay, and let me group these all together, including legal. For instance, a good example is cyber attacks used in election times. In US election in 2016, you probably heard a number of posts being printed, but there's also like a news about bots sharing false information online, and that can have a significant impact on people. For example, some politicians, they have been accused of something that they have not done, but that will damage that person's reputation, and even later on, that has been debunked. The loss of reputation may not come back as what it used to be, and this has been shown by studies. So it's all about how quickly we can respond to cyber attacks to minimize those impacts. Okay. Another one, why do people carry out cyber attacks? Okay, so you can pause the video here and have a think, but try to think to the points made before, then this should be quite easier to answer. Okay, so if you remembered some of the things that we covered in the introduction videos, well, status and fame. People want to be known that they can do some cool stuff. Especially this was true 20 years ago, where highly skilled hackers, if they're not caught, very famous. But even if they're caught, they get hired by the government agencies. This is quite different nowadays because a lot of people just use the tools. That means they're not really technically capable of doing that, just using it. So yeah, don't do it. Illegal financial gains. Okay, this you probably know, like ransomware attacks. Those are highly illegal financial gains. Espionage. You hear things like the country is launching a cyber attack to another country, especially those large countries like the USA, China, Russia. But even the small countries like North Korea might be a good candidate. Basically, they're trying to do something that will damage the reputation of a country or organizations, and those always hits a headline quite quickly and propagate. Okay, yeah. So here's one example. For example, ransomwares. Crypto War made over 130 million US dollars. That's very impressive. But don't be swayed by that. WannaCry made much less than that. Actually, not even 1% of what Crypto War did. That was back in June 2017. But this is probably because we have a lot more different variants of ransomware running around. In the times of Crypto War, that's like, when is it, 2013, 14? That one pretty much infected as many devices as possible. And after that, people came to realize that, this is an issue, start patching things up. And a lot of different variants came out after that to infect different types of systems. And that's why, although specific ransomware may not have large income, you will have lots of different streams that will add up to the total damage, which is quite large still. Okay, so that's pretty much it for this particular video, just introducing some issues and trends and whatnot with the cyber attacks. From next one, we'll look at more specific types of attacks. All right, see you then.